I'll say Shana Tova means Happy New Year. And thank you for remembering that we have a lecture today. We did not have one on Monday. There will be one on Friday. I know those of you who have wanted to get into my office hours have not been able to get a slot normally because, well, first of all, there are 360 of you and one of me, so even if I devoted every slot to you, there wouldn't be enough, but also graduate students tend to get them. And so on Friday, in the hour after lecture, I'm going to go to my office, and any pod of you who would like to walk with me, who are free on Friday at 11, I'd be delighted to have 50 minutes of general conversation or talk about the papers or talk about questions you have about the course or whatever. So there's a little bit of an open hour moment there, and we should take advantage of it. Okay. So I'm going to talk both today and on Friday about socialization. I actually love this PowerPoint theme thing. I'd like to give my whole course about children just so I could use that every time. But what I really want to emphasize is that this issue, which is socialization, how do human beings learn social, whatever they learn? How do they become, how do they internalize, how do they incorporate, how do they learn, what makes them the social creatures they are? That's basically, you could just call it social learning, something like that. Is a very old topic in sociology, very, very old, has been of interest basically forever, and it is amazing how much new research there is about this. It is amazing how much we are learning, and it is absolutely amazing how little we really know. So this is like a very old, kind of tired topic that is suddenly boiling over with new information, largely from new understandings of human biology. So I am going to incorporate some of the current biological thinking into the lecture, but with the warning, the caveat, that this is actually the tip of a very, very large iceberg about which we know amazingly little, and about which in 10 or 20 or 30 years we will know much, much, much more. So, all right, but what we do know is mind-blowing. Okay, but I'm going to start with the basic reality of human evolution, which is that human beings are definitely biological creatures and evolved over thousands and thousands and thousands of years, but they evolved as social creatures. So we are biologically constructed to be social. We grew out of groups that were already social. Human beings were social before they were human, right? So all the creatures that evolved into what became human beings were already living in social groups, right? And the sociality of human beings, their ability to be social, is key to their evolutionary development. So we evolved as creatures who are incredibly dependent with our social environments. And an analogy might be your computer. So I am putting here the language of software and implicitly hardware. So your computer is a physical device that has certain kinds of hardware. But without software, it is built to use software, right? But without software, if your computer is wiped of all software, it's a dead thing, can't do anything. It's not smart. It doesn't have all these wonderful capacities. There's no wonderful iPad functionality that can allow you. All that is software. And human beings are very much like this, which is that without our biological hardware, we could not be what we are. But what's so important about our biological hardware is not that it directly determines our behavior, our thinking, our feeling, but that it is created to suck up, to take on to require vast amounts of socially generated software. And so one just very quick example of this that's better understood than many other processes because there are whole fields in psychology and linguistics that study this, is language and language acquisition. So children do not learn language just by hearing it. That is not true. In fact, as you could imagine, what they hear is a lot of chaotic, broken sentences, partially structured, bad grammar, people changing the way they phrase things every time they turn around. So adult human beings don't always say, for example, subject, verb, object sentences. He hit the ball. They say things like, wow, the ball went out. Or, I've got baseball on the brain, obviously, bad thing, but they don't say, she kicked the can. They say, whoa, that can, that must have hurt your toe. I mean, they just don't speak in blah, 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 blah. It turns out that hardwired is a whole set of processes that prime infants for language learning. And they're starting to understand that these go all the way back, basically, maybe into the womb, but they certainly go from the early days of infancy, so that certain kinds of social responsiveness that are going to be important in conversation. So you take a turn, I take a turn, you take a turn. Turns out little babies can do that. Way before they have any language, they have a language-like structure that then allows them to learn language. It turns out that adults are also quite good at knowing, let's say intuitively, how to simplify language. So, parent looking into the face of his child will respond to what the baby says in certain somewhat stereotypic simplified ways that make it clearer that the baby is saying goo-goo and the father says, bottle, you want your bottle. Okay, bottle. And that process occurs. But the really interesting part of it is that children, when they start to learn language, impose more order, more structure than they hear. So what seems to be built in is a kind of patterning device that takes the relatively chaotic aspects of language and makes it more systematic. So that the built-in part is the part that says, let's make this structural. And the great founder of structural linguistics, he's a nut otherwise, but he was great linguist, Noam Chomsky, really was the person who developed this whole line of thinking and showed that there are powerful structuring devices underlying grammar and all aspects of semantic sentence structure and so forth. And you can think about it in a very clear way. If you have any young siblings or if you watch how young children speak, one of the very clear things they do is that in English, there are all these irregular verbs. So you don't say, I runned down the street. You say, I ran down the street. But little children will use the ed ending on many words where it doesn't apply, because what they're doing, so they never heard that, right? Nobody taught them to say, I runned down the street. But they learned the rule that you make things past tense by adding ed, and then they apply it very systematically, when actually English isn't all that system. In fact, those of you who are English learners will know English is a horrendous language. Awful. I remember apologizing to my kids over and over and just saying, it's terrible. I don't know what to do about it. Things are spelled the same but pronounced differently. They are spelled differently but pronounced identically. What can you do? Just have to learn it. Okay, but the systematicity is built into the brain. But what the systematicity is about is being able to soak up and make use of socially provided content. So there is no such thing as a language built in. There's no language built in. And in fact, the human brain can learn an amazing variety of languages with totally different grammatical structures, right? It depends on the one you're exposed to. So there is nothing built in, and if you never heard language, children who are deprived for whatever reason of language learning during the critical years when it's easiest for the brain to absorb language have a lot of trouble learning it. Those of you who might be trying as adults to master, French, Chinese, Japanese, German, will know that you really wish you had learned it when you were 3 or 4 or 5, when it would have been easy. And now it's, for most of us, not everyone, but most of us, really, really hard. So the brain is wired to do this. But what it's wired to do is soak up, take in, make use of social information. And that is true on every level. So socialization, and this is what I'm going to talk about today, is a very active process of almost pillaging the environment around you for the things that complement the capacities that are built in. So, how should we think about socialization? And I'm going to start with some relatively simple ideas and work up to some more difficult ones. Oh, a little parenthesis here. A student asked me if I would post the slides before the lecture when I could. I said, well, but I work on the lecture down to the last minute. So I have posted the slides before the lecture this time. Yay. But I want you to know I reserve the right to change the slides I don't get to. So you can't treat this as in stone, because there's more material here than I'll get to today, and I hope to figure out more. All right. So what are the ways we have thought about socialization? And the basic ways of thinking about it go very far back in sociology, and I would say in the part of social psychology that deals with child development. And they are first models of conditioning. And those of you who have ever heard of this, there's this famous thing called the Skinner box. So a psychologist named Skinner was sort of the person who either developed or popularized conditioning models. And this is the, Pavlov's dog who learned to salivate at the sound of a bell because he knew that the bell signaled food, so a kind of association between one thing and another, and you're conditioned, and whenever you hear the bell, you salivate because you associate it with food, right? And Skinner had developed this idea that you could raise a child completely in a box, just giving rewards and punishments, and you could create a fully socialized human being. He obviously did not do this, but it exists out there as a kind of fantasy of the extreme of a conditioning model. Now, on the whole, I would say that these models are not any longer considered centrally important ones in thinking about how socialization occurs, because we know so much more now about how much children provide their own sources of social rewards and resist things they're rewarded for. So you can think about the rebellious high school student who knows she'll be kicked out of school if she throws yet another spitball or gets into another fight in the hallway, and she does it anyway, and maybe even does it to defy authority. And the goody-goody kid who studies studiously and gets all the rewards from the teacher. But so yes, I would have said conditioning is, obviously it happens for some things. I had a friend whose father thought a certain version of manners were incredibly important. So if he passed a dish to you and you let him hold it while you served yourself, rather than taking the dish, saying thank you, and serving yourself, if you treated him as he saw it, is ridiculous. But anyway, kind of like a servant, he just dropped the dish. So it shattered, the food spilled. So you would learn pretty quickly in a family like that to grab the dish with both hands. So in that sense, conditioning works, and you probably develop the habit. And many parents, for instance, won't give their child a toy or a treat or whatever until the child automatically says, please. And so, I want the toy. What do we say? May I please have the toy? Here it is. And so over time, yes, you can build habits, and that is a version of conditioning. But the evidence that that is not the central process is that, and here I'm going to go to the work that has been very influential in my thinking. It's old work by a guy named Lawrence Kohlberg. But he showed that when you look at young children who are learning gender, who are learning sex roles, they actively seek out gender-confirming information. So if you reward them for acting, for instance, if you reward little boys for being passive and good and playing with dolls, they still actually want to play with trucks. My son went to a very progressive child care place, and there were no guns allowed and so of course every little boy in the place had a gardening tool in his belt and whipped it out and shot people with it at the first, that was just, that was what everyone did. Now, you're going to think that's biology. I'm going to make a very strong argument later that it has nothing to do with biology. But the point is, it's not conditioning. And in fact, being allowed to enact the gender you are assigned is actually so valuable to children that it's used as a reward. I had another friend whose daughter was very, very active, loved to play, got incredibly dirty, her clothes got all ripped up, but she wanted to wear dresses every day. And of course, this was an incredibly expensive proposition, the little tights that would end up with the knees completely shredded after one wearing, and the dresses that would get torn and dirty and had to be washed. And the mother was saying, sweatpants and t-shirts for you, sweetie. And the daughter was crying, and so they finally worked out a system that one day a week, on Friday, she could wear a dress if she was good or whatever during the week. So here's another example where it's the child's seeking the appropriate gender role that drives the system, not the rewards and punishments the parents provide. Now, all right, so conditioning happens. It's probably important in certain ways, but it's certainly not enough to explain socialization. The second very, very common view of socialization, and in fact, I think this is what people used to think it was all about, is basically indoctrination. So you tell people what you want them to do and how you want them to behave, and that's how you teach them. So, teach your children well and so forth. You tell people how to behave, and, amazingly enough, 0.0001% of the instruction parents, no, I'm kidding, give their children actually sticks. No, probably more. So I tell you in class that you should take notes. I tell you that you should do certain things, and some of you, at least, decide that's relevant, and you listen, and you incorporate what you learn, and you are getting indoctrination from many different sources. So obviously, it can't be that most of what you learn is to do what you're told, because you're being told so many different things by so many different people. Your friends may be telling you one thing, your teacher's telling you another thing, the television telling you something else. And so one of the problems with the model of indoctrination is that we clearly disattend to ignore the vast majority of what we're told. On the other hand, without some instruction, most of us, most of the time, would have no idea what to do, how to live, how to behave. So some kinds of indoctrination work really, really well. If I tell you that throughout your college career, the way to get a guaranteed A in every class is to attend the first 5 lectures and take perfect notes on those 5 lectures, and it really, really works, I wouldn't go so far, but if I were to tell you that and you believed me, it would have a huge effect on your behavior, right? So indoctrination is important, but it's clearly massively insufficient because, and again, I will explain this more later, people pick and choose from the environment what portion of the information they get is reliable, so it's really true and you can count on it, is relevant to them. So again, if you sit in front of a big class of students, the ones who believe that it somehow is about them will hear you, and the ones who think either that this has nothing to do with them, they're not interested in being good students, they don't know what you're talking about, they're not interested in people like you, this has nothing to do with who they are, they won't hear you at all. So there is clearly indoctrination in not a simple sense, or matters a lot, matters what you hear in your environment, what you're taught, what you think is true, but there is some enormous complex process of selectivity that goes on. The third one, and this is probably still the most popular, is imitation. And all our emphasis on role models really implies that we think imitation is really important and that somehow people are more likely to imitate people they think are like them. Imitation, however, is again not as obvious a process as you'd think. And here, one of the great examples is language learning, again, among immigrant children. So, okay, maybe should have already gone to the next slide. Okay, which, here, I'll stay here for a minute, which is that when children learn language, and again, how many of you are American-born children of immigrant parents? Ah, a lot. Okay, so I trust your parents speak English, most of them, at least some, but with a horrendous accent. I'm going to assume that for most of you. And do you speak English with any accent at all? I hope not. Okay, exactly. And so, how could that be? Who did you hear most during your childhood? For many years, your parents, but you filtered out their accented English, and this is a very wide finding. This isn't about you. This is a universal, basically, in linguistics. Children filter out the accents they hear, not only among their parents, but their parents' circles. So many of you were probably raised not only by parents who spoke heavily accented English, but all their friends, and I'm relying on my own circle of immigrant relatives for this, the entire circle speaks, in at least my family circle, various broken languages in completely unpredictable combination. And they speak none of them well, including their childhood language, which they've half forgotten. So the Polish is terrible, the Yiddish is terrible, the French is awful, the English is ridiculous, although very cute. My mother-in-law calls these things on your eye, above your eye, your eyebrows. So your eyebrows have to get plucked, or they have to get painted, or whatever. And if your eyebrows start to fall out, you should get little tattoos. She's got a whole, I need the tattoos, so she's very insistent on the tattoo concept. So she talks about eyebrows, and the other one I just have to share. This thing is a cellophone, like, which I love. Okay, so, and there are many other adorable inventions, let's say, in this kind of English. So, how is it that out of all the babble of bad, broken English kids of immigrant parents hear, or whatever language it is, they hear and selectively attend to what they know is the right English? How do they do that? So imitation matters. If you never heard the dominant type, you couldn't possibly learn it. You have to select models that make sense and seek those out. But clearly, some process, imitation just isn't enough. So something about imitation matters. And in fact, what you see is that when kids need to learn something, they seek out models to imitate. So there are all sorts of examples of this. Some of you might have had a teacher you admired very much, and then you would have, I don't know, taken on her accent or her walk or her style. When I was in high school, I was a somewhat inhibited kid, believe it or not, and I had a girlfriend who was very, very animated. She's hilarious, still one of the funniest people I know. And I just thought she was fantastic. And she used her hands all the time. So I think I unconsciously kind of soaked up everything she had, everything she had. I kind of was enthralled with her being. I still am. And I kind of, at some level, absorbed her. But I absorbed her because, and I don't think it was conscious at all, but because I wanted that set of skills, that set of patterns, that level of vitality. You can't be hilarious just by wanting to, but yeah, okay. I was going to tell you her most hilarious line, but then I realized it's a little risque and I can't. Okay, if you come to me in secret office hours, I'll tell you. Okay, so these passive learner models each have an element of truth to them, but they clearly leave out these very active processes. So now I'm going to talk about these more active models of socialization. And so the first, and here is this cognitive developmental theory, and this again is Kohlberg, whom I've already mentioned, and he developed something called the cognitive developmental theory of sex role socialization. And he pointed out what I've already said, which is when little children start to learn about the existence of the fact that there are boys and there are girls and they're different, a whole set of processes set in. And he argued that those processes are the same processes that children are using to organize their world cognitively. That just means mentally, right? So at the same age at which they start to know, for instance, that dogs and cats are different. So if you ask very young children, if you give the dog pointed ears, can it become a cat? They say yes. Or if you give the cat a dog tail or something, can it be a dog? Oh, yes. And then between about ages 3 and 5, they start to get the idea that various categories of things are actually stable. So that you can't change a dog into a cat. Once it's a cat, it's really a cat. Once it's a dog, it's really a dog. Well, that appears to generate a whole set of very powerful internal processes related to gender, which is that once they start to see that gender is a stable category, so it's not just that you label this person's name is Tom and his name is boy, and this person's name is Jane and her name is girl, or a girl can't become a boy can't become a girl. Once they start to get the idea this is stable, it's attached to the self, and it's important, right? That the world is really made up of, at least in current, and certainly when Kohlberg wrote, 2 categories. This becomes incredibly loaded for them. And what you get is that children seek out gender-appropriate behavior. And this, just like what I said about language learning, where the kids do it more systematically than anything they're hearing in the world, they do gender the same way. They become these little, to use Rush Limbaugh's phrase, they become little gender Nazis. So you will see little girls. I always want to take pictures of this on the street, and then I know the mothers will think I'm a perverted stalker or something like this. But I would love someone to really do a collection of girl looks, because at those ages, and for most kids it's between about 3 and 5, you get this incredibly exaggerated gender behavior. Amazing. So the little girls are wearing dresses with sparkles all over them, and they want to wear their bride dress to school, and they want to wear tutus everywhere. And again, you will see this weird combination of the tights with the unbelievably shredded knees. So the girl is just as active, plays just as rough, enjoys running and falling and climbing on the jungle gym, but she wants to look like a princess. You can also see this at Halloween, you know, where this is the real chance the girls get. But, you know, and it's not 100%, so not all girls do this. Actually, my own daughter was never, no bride, no nothing. No ballerina, no princess, no bride. Every Halloween witch. That was the surviving category. But I was amazed, because most little girls, you cannot tear them away from their, again, the ballerina, bride, you name it. And likewise, little boys go through this, everything is a gun, they have to have cars, they wear only boy colors, so pink is just, ugh. And little girls will wear nothing but pink. And they really go through this hugely intense phase of getting gender straight. But the key, what I'm really arguing here, is not that this is their natural gender welling up from their deep biological, hormonal, or genetic code. It is a very active need to master the world and understand it, and understand where they themselves fit into it in this critical category. And so during the period when they are learning this and consolidating it, they hugely exaggerate the differentness of the genders. They hugely exaggerate, again, the clothing, the style, and different kids will attach. My son, I'll be killed if he ever watches this, but he won't, went through about 2 years where all his little jockey shorts had to be black. And there was this Cotton & Company, still exists, sold different colors of underwear. And we literally, I mean, he would have just had a fit if anybody tried to put him in white underwear. It was somehow, this was his period of learning. He was a boy, and he was, you know, whoa. So actually, I think the best thing you can do to, this is parenting advice, and maybe not all that relevant yet to most of you, but I think the way that kids get over this the quickest is if you're very, very reassuring about it. You say, oh boy, you're a boy. Oh yes, you're a boy. Oh, are you a boy? What a boy you are. And then, then they're less worried about clinging to that truck and clinging to that gun and clinging to that black outfit or whatever it is. And when that ends, it's like they get gender straight, and you've got this whole little closet of little girl dresses, and your first grader or your kindergartner loses interest and happens overnight, forget about it. She's not going to wear those dresses. She threw a tantrum to get them, and you just might as well pack them up nicely and give them to her cousin or her little niece or something like that, because she's not going to wear them again. She's going to wear basketball shorts and T-shirts, or I mean, of course it differs. Some people are haute femme their whole lives, but basically that's the pattern. And again, it has to do with getting gender straight. I'm going to tell a little anecdote, and this is from my Jewish life. We used to live in San Francisco, went to a big synagogue there called Beth Shalom, big old synagogue with very traditional, you know, the rabbi and the cantor wearing these sort of black, like choir robes, like graduation robes. And so our kid was about 3, and there was another family that also had a little boy about 3. And we were about 200 people in the service, and those of you, this type of service anyway, a little bit chaotic, so it's not completely quiet, and everybody isn't always respectful and everything. But there was this moment, we would keep our kids there, and then when they got cranky, there was a little back door, and you could take them down to the library. So we all sat on one side nearest that door. And there was this moment of sudden silence, and the rabbi and cantor are up there, and the cantor's just finished whatever singing he was doing or whatever, and not us, but this little boy named Sam, who sat about a row away from us, his little voice pipes up in this moment of silence and says, "Mommy, does the rabbi have a vagina?" And his mother was just, and she was very cool, and she said, "When you're in synagogue, the things that are most important to you are what come up," something like that. But you could see he was doing exactly this. That is, here was this person who was male, but wearing this dress-like structure, and he couldn't get straight in his mind which gender was which. That is, wait a minute, this person was pretty clearly a male person, but was wearing something like what women wear. So, and this is he was trying to get cognitively straight this incredibly important category. So cognitive developmental theory really suggests that when you are developing an identity that really matters to you, gender being one of the very primordial ones, it drives a whole bunch of other behavior. If you are developing an identity as a born-again Christian, then all sorts of other things that do not matter to people normally will matter enormously to you. You will be looking for signals from your pastor, from your fellow congregants, about how a truly born-again Christian behaves. You will watch your language. You will avoid cursing. You will be self-conscious about how disciplined your behavior is. And again, all sorts of things that wouldn't matter to you will matter to you when that identity becomes important to you. If you re-identify with your ethnic group, and often going to college is a huge ethnic shocker that you didn't think it was the most important part of you, but suddenly in your college environment, people are being categorized in this way, you will attach those elements to your identity. You will seek them out. So it is a social signal. I'm not saying you seek them out from your instincts or from your basic, some primordial psychic need. It's the social process of organizing an identity turns you into an active seeker who shapes your own socialization. And one of the really important examples of this are children raised by single parents. So again, if you look at gender socialization, there's a lot written about, oh my goodness, boys raised by single mothers, how do they learn to be men? Well, the answer is, if they figure out that they're boys, they look for role models, an uncle, a cousin who's a toughie. Now, they may get a more exaggerated version if they don't see that at home the man can be exhausted, sympathetic, gentle, weak, tired, nervous, and they see only the more public person. They may get, but they will look for, they do not actually find it impossible to learn the appropriate gender role, right? They do learn the appropriate gender role by seeking, by actively seeking. So even if you sit near your mother day after day and watch her putting on makeup in the morning, you may, when you're really little, if that's what she does, that's what you'll do. A little girl will take, her father's razor, let's hope not, but you could imagine if that's what she sees, she will think that's, until she gets it, that that's not what girls do. And the same way, little boys will do what they see as appropriate things boys do. So in all sorts of ways, we reach out beyond our immediate environment and pull in the things that are somehow relevant to our identities. And those identities are shaped in large part by the organization of social definitions of who we are. But even within those, and this is part of the process we don't understand very well, we clearly select some identities as more desirable than others, some identities as more relevant to something we already perceive about ourselves. So if you were, I don't know, an awkward, studious, somewhat socially uncomfortable person, the identity of, you know, nerd or whatever, smart student but nerdy, might actually work for you. And you would know that the identity of rah-rah cheerleader was never going to be you. So even if you kind of from a distance longingly admired such people, the stuff that was relevant to you would be the teacher saying, oh, you're really bright, you should go to a good college or whatever. So this is part of the active role of socially available identities, I'll put it in that way, in driving socialization. A second very important point about socialization, and this goes back to a theorist who really wrote his major works in the 1930s. So, yeah, 20s and 30s, George Herbert Mead. Is one of the great American social theorists. So most of the social theorists you read are European-born, all the ones you read. But he was a truly American thinker. And actually, he wrote about baseball. I knew there's a no. And one of the points he made, which is very, very important corrective to those first three images of socialization, is that you never learn just your own role. Okay? So I've, in the first point, made a big point about the girl wants to learn to be a girl, the boy wants to learn to be a boy. But Mead made the point that you can't perform your own role effectively if you can't, what he called, take the role of the other. Right? So to learn to be a boy, you actually have to also know how girls behave. And it's even more clear, and he actually wrote a lot about children's play. So when children do fantasy play, often they do, let's go to the grocery store, oh, I'll buy the bread and you be the clerk and you sell it to me. Or I'll be the postman and I'll deliver the letter and you'll get the letter. Or I'll be the mommy and you'll be the daddy. And when my son used to play this, he would say, oh yes, okay, I'll be the daddy and you be the mommy. Oh no, he would say, you be the daddy and you be the mommy and I'll be the tiger. He thought every family had to have its own tiger. But these role-playing games are games in which children learn this fundamental reality, which is that you can't be the child if you don't understand how parents behave. And you can't be the parent if you don't understand how children behave. You can't be the teacher if you don't understand what it is to be a student. You can't be a student if you don't understand what it is to be a teacher. All these roles are in reciprocal relationship. And the baseball example is he said, you know, you can't be a second baseman if you don't understand what first basemen and pitchers and batters do. Right? Because your job is going to be to watch the pitch, watch how the batter hits it, catch the ball, and throw it to first base. That's what second basemen, ideally, that's not the only thing they do, but that is the basic thing they do. And so you have to understand all the different positions in a basketball game, a football game, a chess game, or you can't play your part. You'd be, if you act in a theater company, if you don't know any role but your own, you can't play, right? You at least have to know the cue where you come in and the cue where you stop, or else you just repeat all your lines and there'd be no play. So this is a very, very fundamental point about how socially interdependent social learning is. So what children do is learn a huge amount about society in general in order to learn to be the specific kind of person they are. It's as if what you're saying is that you internalize partly a very broad understanding of the whole social world that allows you to play your little part in it more or less responsively. I wouldn't say correctly, but responsively. And it's that, Mead used this language. He talked about the generalized other. And part of what he meant by that was that you learn to imagine yourself as others see you. And again, if you can't do that, very deeply autistic people, I think, have trouble doing that. Various other kinds of emotional disorders or cognitive disorders, you have that problem. But normal social self-regulation really depends on extraordinary sensitivity to others and to the way others might see you. Now, you might be wrong about that, but if you do something embarrassing, I've done a couple of real amazingly embarrassing things lately, which I still feel bad about. Terrible. But it's imagining how others see you. It's usually not that somebody came up to you and said, do you realize you made a complete fool of yourself by doing X? People just don't do that. But you feel, oh my God, oh. And that is a very healthy part of you. It's not necessarily healthy to obsess about your weaknesses and failings, but it's a very healthy part of you that you can perceive how other people might see your behavior. That's part of the very important social self-regulation. And let me just point out that it's that very social responsiveness that probably allowed the Milgram experiment to work the way it did, right? It's because people are deeply social creatures who respond to other people's behavior that when you say, but can't we go in and check on the guy? Can't we check on the guy? Can't we check on the guy? And the person says, no, we can't. You say, okay, all right, I tried. I did my best. I couldn't. We normally don't just break social routines and say, I don't want to be here. I'm not going to do this. I'm not here. Okay. The third, and this is sort of evidence that confirms the active aspects. I've already talked about language learning among immigrant children, but I want to add a wrinkle quickly. So I said that you and children everywhere learn the language of the dominant society, not the language they hear most commonly immediately around them. Now, what that really implies is that they not only can select certain models to imitate, but that they understand what is the publicly legitimate, or I would even say the prestigious, or the dominant model. And they actually understand very, very young that their family is not the dominant type. Now, that suggests that very, very young children can figure out that there is a hierarchy in the social world and something about where their families fit into it. I think this is related to one child behavior, which is asking questions over and over and over and asking the same thing again and again and asking everyone. Partly, I think they're trying to figure out which things are just things you happen to think and which things are really true and everybody thinks them. And so they want to know how reliable it is that people will say this and whether it's really the socially authoritative knowledge or just their family's little weirdness. But there is an exception to this, at least one, and Joe Greenberg, one of the great linguists of all times, told me this. that there was a community of Greek speakers who ended up in Turkey, and Greece and Turkey became enemies. So the Greek speakers went to Turkey in about 1850, ended up fleeing basically back to Greece in the 1950s, and they spoke a very old-fashioned Greek that was not like the Greek in the surrounding community because they'd been cut off for about 100 years. And that Greek was very high status. And their children spoke like their parents and not like the surrounding community, because children can differentiate where status lies. Make a last point, which is another amazing example of this, which is called anticipatory socialization in the literature, has to do with summer learning before college. And studies have been done showing that kids of identical intelligence, grades, GPA, SAT scores, who are not going to college learn less in the summer before college than kids who know they're going to college, because the kids who know they're going to college pick up everything they think might be relevant for college students. So they hear a new vocabulary word, they learn it. They hear about an important book, they learn it. They hear about a hot new music genre, they learn it.